Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Regional Plan Association's most recent webinar on the Homes on Track report of current conditions of TOD opportunities in Connecticut. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the Connecticut Director of the Regional Plan Association, and I'm joined today by my colleague Marcel, the Director of Land Use here at RPA, who's going to be deep diving into the report we just did. As folks are still filtering in, I just wanted to give a little bit of context setting for folks. This is a continuation of a project that we started in New Jersey and New York, specifically on TOD opportunities around commuter rail stations. And we wanted to continue that in Connecticut with a slight twist, actually. We are expanding this report and future reports we'll talk about to also include bus service in Connecticut. And one of the reasons that we're really excited about this as a regional approach, but certainly excited about this report in Connecticut, is we really want to emphasize the importance of transit-oriented development, or is what we typically call in Connecticut transit-oriented communities. And the reason we're focusing so much on this at RPA across the region, but certainly in Connecticut, is it's really a vehicle and a framework to address both the dual crises of the housing shortage we have and also the climate crisis that we're facing. We all know we need a considerable amount of homes built in the region, but we can't do it the same way that we did it through much of the 20th century, which is low density, single use, car centric planning. So what we're really trying to emphasize is that transit oriented communities, the idea of centering transit around our development and growth, can meet both of those crises head on. The great thing about, of course, our region is we have a considerable legacy of transit to build off of. There is a lot of work to be done in our region and in Connecticut, but we're excited about the opportunities here and want to emphasize that this is something that other states are leading on as well, certainly in Massachusetts, Maryland, Colorado, most recently in California, the passing of SB 79, which Marcel will talk a little bit about. So that's all to say that, RPA is leading on this issue in terms of our research and advocacy, and we're seeing other states adopting similar types of approaches and recognizing how much the state needs to step up with its infrastructure investments, which its planning approaches. We have, as I said, a long way to go in Connecticut in the region to put these ideas into practice. But what we're really attempting to accomplish with this current conditions report is to give everybody from policymakers, local stakeholders, a good context of what are the opportunities in Connecticut around rail and around bus. And this is just the first report of several that we will be working on to get into more of a scoring and identifying specific opportunity in the short, mid, and long term. Marcel will talk a little bit more about that as a little teaser. But we're really excited about this work, really appreciative of the research that we put together on this report. Folks that attended the YIMBYtown conference last month got a little bit of a sneak peek about this report, but we've already shared this report with folks in the governor's office, with the legislature, and we're doing the rounds with some of the COGs in Connecticut as well. So we really want this to be a base of not just future research and advocacy at RPA, but to really drive the conversation towards transit-oriented communities across the state. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Marcel, who's going to jump into the presentation.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. Am I sharing the screen? Can somebody confirm if you're looking at the right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Pete. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for having me. So yeah, I'll go over the report that Pete explained. It is published on our website, so you can see the details at your own pace later. But we'll be largely focusing on the content of that report. We know that transit-oriented communities in Connecticut play a significant role in providing access to the state's housing and labor markets. That's one of the main conclusions and things that we measured in this report. We basically, as Pete mentioned, it is an existing conditions report, and we describe and document the relations that the transit network has with housing and employment, density and urbanization, environment, in particular with in regards to water management and socioeconomic conditions. A following report will identify specific opportunities for continuing to scale this approach in Connecticut. But before we go deeper into it, just again, some general context setting for those that are not as familiar with the concept of transit-oriented communities or development. The literature has over and over shown that the access to abundant homes can lower expenses and improve affordability, especially when it is coupled with public transportation. And that integrated approach is largely what is known as a transit-oriented development or transit-oriented communities. These have the potential to address cost of living issues, including and most obviously housing and transportation related costs. But it also has important benefits, including economic impact benefits and environmentally sustainable outcomes. Over the history of RPA, we have extensively documented and studied all these beneficial impacts that stem from better and more efficient public transportation systems and the interdependencies that exist with land use. While transit-oriented communities make sense for many reasons, their implementation is not exactly straightforward. This approach involves aligning housing, transportation, and placemaking priorities, which requires coordination across multiple stakeholders and agencies that are operating at different geographic scales and have different programmatic goals. So states across the country are increasingly recognizing the value of transit-oriented development and the crucial role they must play to facilitate it. Many have been proactively implementing reforms and changes to promote it. That includes most recently California with the SB 79 legislation that was adopted just last week, but also in Massachusetts, Maryland, Colorado, and beyond. Here in the tri-state region, there has been some progress, although it's been slower and in a more modest scale. In the context of Connecticut, this includes the creation of the Municipal Development Authority, which was established in 2019 and funded last year, with now aiding towns and downtowns with transit district development backed by 60 million in bonds. And separately, many of the state's councils of government, or COGs, are creating regional level TOD or TOC related plans and assisting municipalities with TOD planning. But despite of all this, and some examples successful examples across the state, as I will walk us through, many communities in the state are still facing challenges in providing sufficient housing and coordinating it with public transportation. So we think strongly that more can and should be done. To that preamble, I'll walk us through the specific content in the report. Again, just for general context, the state is divided by 9 regional councils of government and 169 localities. The most populous councils are the Capital Region, Western Connecticut, South Central Connecticut, Nantucket Valley, and Greater Bridgeport, which together account for nearly 3 million people, representing over 80% of the state's total population. And most of the transit assets and network is also located in these 5 regions. Again, the Capital Region, Western Connecticut, South Central, Nantucket, and Greater Bridgeport. And you can see the overlap once you map the transit network over these 5 councils of government. To start this analysis, we collected transit information largely based on General Transit Feed Specification Data, or GTFS, which is a common data format for public transportation schedules and associated geographic information. But we also manually added some bus routes and stops that were missing, particularly in northeastern and northwestern Connecticut. We had to manually geocode those to get a more complete picture of the existing transit network. There are over 50 stations that are served by the rail network, and these include the New Haven Line, Shoreline East, the Hartford Line, and Amtrak. Most of these are concentrated in southwestern part of the state. 23 passenger rail stations, which account for 44% of the state's total, are located in Western Connecticut, the Western Connecticut planning region. And those are in Greenwich, Stamford, Darien, Norwalk, Westport, Richfield, Wilton, Danbury, and Bethel. With a total of 10 stations, the South Central Planning Region has the second largest number of passenger rail stations. They're all located in Milford, West Haven, New Haven, Brantford, Guilford, Madison, Wallingford, and Meriden. The Nantucket Valley Planning Region has 6 stations, making it the third cog with the most stations. This is followed by the Greater Bridgeport region with 5, and then the Capital Region with 4 rail stations. However, if you also include the 4 stops that are part of the CT Fast Track, which is the state's bus rapid transit or BRT system, will give you a total of 8 stations. The lower Connecticut River Valley has 3, and southeastern Connecticut has 2 stations. There are no rail stations in Northwest Hill or Northeast Cogs. When it comes to bus stops, there's a lot more bus stops. There's over 14,000 bus stops that are distributed throughout the state. The Capital Region has the largest share of those stops, with nearly 5,000. And we're representing nearly a third of the total in the state. South Central follows with about 3,000 stops and accounting 20% of the total. And Lower Connecticut River Valley ranks third with over 1,800 stops or 13% of the total. And you can see the following cogs dropping from there. To study the existing conditions across the state, we defined a study area based on this distribution of the rail stations and bus stops. We drew half a mile radius around each rail station and then a quarter mile around bus stops to define what the report refers to as the Connecticut Transit Zone. With this geographical definition, we then examined the distribution of population, households, jobs, and infrastructure, among other factors. The concentration of housing and employment in relation to the transit zone highlights the need for more coordinated housing, transportation, and economic development planning efforts across the state. When we compared the transit zone against the distribution of the housing stock, we found that areas served by the transit zone represent only 9% of the state. That's like about 280,000 acres out of 3 million or over 3 million. But it concentrates almost half of those households that are across the state. This map is showing that distribution with each dot representing approximately 50 units of housing units and the relation they have with transit zone boundaries. The transit zone includes about 640,000 households, representing 48% or almost half of the 1.3 million units throughout the state. Similarly, this map is showing the distribution of employment of jobs, with each dot representing 50 jobs. This concentration within the transit zone boundaries is even greater than that of housing, including approximately 1 million jobs, which represents 65% or 2/3 of the 1.5 million jobs that exist throughout the state. On an acreage basis, the places around in the composite transit zone, shown here in the purple bars, have almost 9 times the number of households and 20 times more jobs when compared to areas that are outside of the transit zone boundaries, represented here in gray. So this concentration of residents and jobs and in these areas that are served by transit highlights the importance of aligning housing and transportation planning efforts in Connecticut. The transit zone plays a disproportionate role in providing access to the state's housing and labor markets. So planning and investing in these areas will likely go a long way to improve affordability, bolster economic activity, and preserve open space for the well-being of the state's residents. That's the main case that we're suggesting, that it makes sense to move forward with that type of approach. But if we look deeper into some of the other variables, there's even more reasons to consider why this is an important approach to consider strongly and pursue further. When we look at the density and composition of land use, as well as the urban design characteristics of a given area, These can indicate the type of development and the type of programming that could happen in a given location. Places that have greater land use mixes and moderate to high residential densities are generally better suited for near-term opportunities that could create transit-oriented communities. And aside from transit service levels, other attributes can determine the viability and that includes, of course, the amount of underdeveloped land or vacant land, but also things like the strict grid configurations and things like sewer infrastructure. More compact and mixed-use forms of development largely depend on the availability and access to public transportation. Areas with higher residential density and urban design attributes can create functional, attractive, and well-connected spaces, and these have to have more people and households within a smaller space, which makes it easier to support frequent and reliable service. This higher density then translates into more potential riders, which then could also offset the cost of providing service and reduce the need for government subsidies, which in the state of Connecticut is a reality. At the same time, this increased density enables and justifies larger investments in transit infrastructure and other types of services. And this virtuous cycle helps reduce the dependency on private vehicles, which are a significant source of pollution and environmental degradation. Here is one example of a fairly new mixed-use development in South Norwalk, and that mingles existing historic structures along Monroe Street. And it has an engaging street wall and sidewalk improvements, added greenery and vegetation, and which together offer just a better pedestrian experience, and which leads riders or potential riders to the rail station, which you can see in the background of this image. This other example is near State Street Station in downtown New Haven, where they created housing and retail space on a former surface parking lot. New Haven is also working on a Lower State Street redesign project to improve pedestrian, cyclist, and traffic safety, as well as further unlocking development potential of other underutilized parking lots in this area. In Elmwood, this is an example of an underutilized lot adjacent to the Elmwood Fast Track Station, which developed 54 units and included streetscape improvements as well. This complex is part of the plans to reconstruct the new Park Avenue corridor towards better alignment of transit and housing. And this other example is on Colony Street, adjacent to Meriden Station. It fits well with the downtown context and makes the street more inviting. The additional station wayfinding and signage orients the riders more clearly towards the transit. Here's another example in Meriden in the same area. Is Meriden Green is a remediated brownfield site which was transformed into a park, and it acts as flood control, recreational area, and connection to the train station. It used to be disconnected before they made these improvements, and it is an example of how transit-oriented communities support the alignment of land use and housing with improving walkability, micromobility, accessibility, resiliency, and connectivity. So the question is then, how do we scale these good examples of transit-oriented communities through the rest of the state? While those are examples of good transit-oriented communities, most of the state's housing stock is located in car-centric areas that lack the necessary residential density and ridership to support transit. Pictured here are examples of these low-density car-centered areas that are currently served by transit within the transit zone, and just highlighting places in Brantford, Windsor Locks, Old Saybrook, and Wilton. To support any form of regular on-street bus service, literature usually suggests that the minimum residential density required is between 6 to 8 units per acre for a transit corridor, and that's applicable to Connecticut. For express bus service that relies solely on pedestrian access, a minimum average density of about 15 units per acre is necessary. However, ridership at these minimum densities tends to be relatively low and primarily concentrated during peak commuting hours. As residential densities increase, so does ridership. And in downtown areas, the minimum density of around 50 jobs or employees per acre is essential to support regular transit service. This map shows these residential density thresholds across the state and the relation to the transit zone, with the lighter shades of yellow indicating lower density locations and the darker shades of orange tones indicating higher density. You can see by the map, the vast majority, it's like in the lighter tones of yellow. Less than 22% of the housing stock in the transit zone, that is over 300,000 housing units, are located in areas with sufficient density to support to sustain bus service. Less than 7% is located in areas with sufficient density to support express bus service. Even within the transit zone boundaries, approximately 290,000 units, or 42% of the stock within the transit zone, are situated in car-centric areas that lack the density to support bus service. This shortage of compact, walkable, and transit-oriented communities across the state is not really driven by market or free market forces. It's rather by restrictive land use regulations. Most towns in Connecticut have large lot single-family zoning and prohibit multifamily housing even near transit stations. Single-family housing is permitted on an as-of-right basis on 99% of the state's zoned residential land. Additionally, 70% of the land is exclusively zoned for single-family housing, allowing only this type of housing. Only 2.2% of the land is zoned for multifamily housing, which defined as for having 4 units or more. So it is very restrictive, and that's like what largely explaining that lack of sufficient density to support transit. Restrictive land use policies and lack of regional integrated approaches between housing and transportation planning efforts are not only limiting the state's economic potential, but have also led to incremental degradation and more costly infrastructure to build and maintain. Transit-oriented communities and infill development can be effective strategies for land conservation. Using already developed land, infill development can reduce pressure in lower density areas, preserving and improving the quality of open spaces such as wetlands, forests, wildlife habitats, and water resources. Sprawling development, which lengthens distances residents must have to travel to work, school, run errands, creates greater dependency on cars, and the impacts of private vehicles come with costly negative externalities, a lot of it which is subsidized by non-road users. A recent study from the Harvard Kennedy School quantified this in the context of Massachusetts and concluded that the annual price tag for maintaining the state's car economy is over $60 billion, more than half of that coming from public funding. So this puts the cost of investing in public transportation projects into perspective, because relying solely on roads and vehicles is not really a free option. We know also that efficiencies compound in favorable way when towns, cities, and metro areas grow in more compact patterns. As more housing units are built along a road or a sewer line, the capital cost of infrastructure and services per home decreases. Consistent findings demonstrate that the cost of infrastructure and administrating services increases directly with the distance between homes, and in particular when it comes to sewer systems. Existing sewered areas, which are shown in this map, can provide a feasible approach for expanding transit-oriented communities. This is showing the strong spatial overlap that exists between the transit zone and the existing sewered areas. More than 623,000 units, which represent nearly 90% of the housing stock in the transit zone, is also located in areas that have access to sewer service, which is great news. If we further break down these statistics and the relation that the housing stock has with the transit zone and sewered areas, we see that nearly 921,000 units, or 62% of the total housing stock in the state, is located in areas with access to sewer service. Approximately 20% of the stock is located in sewered areas, but not within the transit zone. So they have sewers, but not access to transit. Given the larger expenses associated with sewer infrastructure and related operations, housing stock in these areas that are already sewered, but not within the transit zone, could provide a feasible alternative to expand transit service and further encourage transit-oriented communities. Transit-oriented communities also offer a viable alternative for the state to adapt to climate change, growing and more severe impacts, as Pete mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. When we measure the relation of the housing stock, the transit zone, and areas that are at high flood risk, it certainly seems to be true. Most of the housing stock is not affected by high flood risk areas. Over 660,000 units, or 45% of Connecticut's housing stock, are located within the transit zone and in low flood risk areas, defined as areas beyond FEMA's high risk flood hazard categories. Some locations within the transit zone will require additional funding and planning to minimize flood risk, but these represent a minority. Approximately 40,000 units, or 2.6% of the state total, are in high flood risk areas and within the transit zone. And the final chapter of the report looks into socio-demographic conditions. We know that restrictive land use policies, as I mentioned earlier, and the lack of regional integrated approaches between housing and transportation planning have not only limited the state's economic potential, but have also exacerbated long-standing inequities. Residents in Connecticut living in single-family zoning neighborhoods generally have higher incomes and are predominantly white, less likely to be Black or Hispanic, and more likely to hold a bachelor's degree and own homes compared to those in multifamily zones. Conversely, households within the transit zone are predominantly composed of multi-family buildings and have lower incomes and disproportionately are Black and Hispanic. Compared to the state's total racial and ethnic composition, residents in the transit zone are disproportionately Black, Hispanic, Asian, and American Native. More than 3/4 of the state's Hispanic and Black populations reside within the transit zone, at 77% and 83% respectively, totaling over 817,000 residents. More than half of the state's Asian and American Native population live within the transit zone. That corresponds to 56 and 63% respectively, or almost 100,000 people. While over 1 million white residents live in the transit zone, they constitute 52% of the total population in the transit zone, compared to 65% of this total state population. If we look at household income and its relation to transit zone, generally, the state has higher median incomes concentrated on the southwestern part of the state. But also, when it comes to the transit zone specifically, we can say that the virtually all of the state's households that are earning less than 50,000 in the lower income bracket are residing within the transit zone. That approximately 138,000 households, corresponding to 99% of the population in that income bracket, are in the transit zone, are living in the transit zone. Approximately 182,000 out of 281,000 households earning between 70,000 and below the state's median income reside within the transit zone. That's like 65% of the middle income households. In contrast, only 45% out of 208,000 households that are earning $150,000 or more live in the transit zone. That's 21% of the higher income households in the state. So agencies and stakeholders, and that includes the recently created Development Authority, should be working towards a data-driven framework to identify and bolster opportunities for transit-oriented communities along the state's network. This type of a framework should be developed to inform and support transit-oriented development policies and projects in several ways. First, investments, helping determine the planning support and infrastructure funding needed to make station areas transit-oriented. Helping prioritize investments and financing based on timing and location, and identifying suitable local and state grants to guide their scale. Second, regulations. this type of framework could help identify where flexible land use regulations and streamlined procedures can promote housing near transit. Uh, Focus on areas where simplified permitting and exemptions from environmental reviews can enhance development potential. And finally, regarding affordable housing, this type of analysis or framework can also help prioritize subsidies for affordable housing and implement protections in areas that are vulnerable to social displacement. Just to give you a little bit of like a preview of the next report that we'll be finalizing in the upcoming month, this table summarizes some of the main categories that we are developing. And that includes first what we refer to as near-term stations, shown here in red. These have most of the physical and mobility characteristics that are required for successful TOD and need relatively minor enhancement or changes. Then in yellow, you have midterm stations, which have some mobility attributes but are missing either physical characteristics or high quality intermodal service or development capacity or like availability of underdeveloped land, and often need extensive zoning changes to allow for more mixed use and multifamily developments. And lastly, shown in blue, we have the long-term stations, which tend to have a significant amount of underutilized land, but lack key mobility and physical characteristics. These tend to need the largest scope of interventions and infrastructure investments that should be guided by master planning and larger, more comprehensive type of planning efforts. These are all potentially suitable for transit-oriented development and can support more housing. However, each type of station will require varying degrees of interventions and support to support transit-oriented development, and that's why we're making this distinction in terms of a time frame. The way that we're building this rubric or scoring system is shown here in this slide. The elements that are required for successful TOD, as I've been alluding, require a combination of high quality infrastructure that connects people with jobs, walkable, pedestrian friendly environments, and of course the land where you need to build on. And so the system that we were using to classify these opportunities across stations and the transit zone are based on these two key scores. The first one, what we refer to as the transit orientation score, which indicates how supportive the surrounding physical environment is for TOD and the level of transit service. This factor is built for mobility and environment characteristics. And then we have a underutilized land score, which provides a measure of growth potential based on the amount of underdevelopment and growth projections for the specific area. We already did this in New York and New Jersey. Here's that map, and you could also find that report on our website. But you notice that the stations in Connecticut are not mapped, and so that's what we're working and hoping to be releasing before the end of the year. So with that, I'll take it back to Pete, and happy to open this for Q&A. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Marcel. This is really exciting that we're filling out the rest of the region on the rail side of things. And obviously folks then can compare all three states on rail side. But we are really excited about, particularly on the bus side of things in Connecticut. And in addition to having a report coming out by the end of the year on the scorecards for rail, early next year, we're going to have a second report, or I guess a third report technically, on scoring for bus stations. And it'll be a slightly different methodology. So we didn't feel pressure to do them all at once. We did want to have rail across the region. But something I want to tease out too, RPA is really invested in developing this large scale bus advocacy campaign for Connecticut. We all know there's quite a bit of pressure on the federal side in terms of infrastructure dollars, and it seems like every day the president cancels some big project RPA has been working on for decades. So at the very least in Connecticut, we're not anticipating a lot more investment on new rail infrastructure. There's been some really great progress on double tracking some of the branch lines, improving stations, and adding a couple new stations coming up. But we really see a lot of opportunity, particularly state-led opportunity, to invest in the bus network. That's really the driver of public transportation services in Connecticut. It's the best way to connect jobs to people, as Marcel's report shows. So I just want to tease out that as we've been doing this presentation, other folks in the legislature and the governor's office, people are saying, okay, what are you guys doing next with this? And this is what's coming up. Obviously, we've been working on Work, Live, Ride as our TOC development plan to complement CMDA. That remains in limbo. We are, just to give folks, I'm sure, that are curious, the latest we're hearing on a potential special session is still mid-November after the municipal elections. We're hearing it's relatively close to having a deal, potential announcement. That's not quite there yet. We're not anticipating any significant changes for Work, Live, Ride. That does seem to be intact as we anticipated. But we are a bit of a limbo on the rail side of things, certainly, with depending on what happens there. But we're really excited about using this current conditions report as a way to make the case that if we do some smart investments on the transit side, particularly on the bus side, we can unlock a considerable amount of development that we already have some infrastructure for. So with that, I definitely encourage folks to share questions in the Q&A. I've got a couple lined up, having done this a few times with Marcel, that I'm sure folks are interested in. On the top of the question, just to clarify a little bit of what the report isn't, Marcel, you have a great bit of data on sewer coverage that becomes quite a topic in Connecticut about capacity. This is not a report talking about capacity of the system, right? It was a binary where there is capacity or not. Do you have any sense of where there is aging water capacity or new capacity or not?
Yeah, thanks, Pete, for making the distinction. I think the short answer is not really. The information that we were able to retrieve from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, I believe, simply shows the boundaries of active or sewer areas that are active. And that's what we use to see if there's a housing unit in that location, but it doesn't really describe if it's at capacity or how much capacity, unused capacity it has remaining. That will be an interesting analysis to do to really measure that. But having said that, I in my remarks, and there's plenty of research that shows that expanding existing capacity where you already have the sewer lines is probably a lot more efficient and affordable than it is to expand and serve through areas that are sprawling and adding new sewer lines. That's exponentially much more costly to build and maintain. And so, even without having done the capacity analysis, I could feel very confident that if somebody does that type of cost benefit assessment, they will realize that still, increasing that capacity within these sewer areas is going to be, the better option than sprawling out, right? And so, yeah, I that's the longer version of the answer, but it would be interesting if there was a more, and if somebody knows about it, please do share it. If there's somebody knows about documentation that we could use to join those geographies with information that describes the capacity of each of those places.
Yeah, and I'll give one more shout out to Work, Live, Ride. This was one of the big parts of this Office of Responsible Growth Interagency Council. The first thing when Work, Live, Ride passes that this new council of other agencies related to infrastructure spending will be doing is getting a capacity of existing water and sewer. It doesn't exist at a state level. Of course, local systems monitor that, but we'll have a really good sense in whatever version of Work, Live, Ride eventually passes to get that. But that is a question that does come up. Sometimes it's good faith, sometimes it's bad faith, but we want to see more research there. One other aspect, and I'll get to some of the questions in the chat. This was something that you had flagged, Marcel, at the YIMBYtown presentation, but we emphasized climate change, of course, is a major impact on the housing market. That was a big theme of the YIMBYtown conference. We had some great panels on insurance industry and how finance is going to drive where homes are built, where people are going to be living, which in the short term, is raising prices for everybody. In the long term, it does mean there are projections of millions of people moving across the country. We think we want a lot of them to come to our region, but the climate risk is not distributed evenly in the climate and in the region. So, you have the number of what stations or the transit district area is vulnerable to flooding, but even compared to New York and New Jersey, Connecticut's much lower. Just was curious if you could talk a little bit about that, just in terms of some high level percentages. Just we want to tell folks in Connecticut that we need to grow more. There's a lot of opportunity to grow in Connecticut for a number of these reasons, but even just in the region, Connecticut's a lot safer.
Yeah, so that is true, and maybe that's something that we could elaborate or flesh out further in the upcoming report, especially for rail. But we have looked at New Jersey and New York, and it is true that when you look specifically at flood risk and flood risk in relation to the transit zones, uh, Connecticut does stand out in a way that very very little of its housing stock or the area in around these transit zones is affected by high flood risk. Uh, Compared to New Jersey and South Jersey in particular, those areas are served by transit, but are at high risk from flood, particularly coastal flood impacts. Uh, as is Long Island. Long Island is and parts of Metro North along the Hudson River. So when you look at it from that perspective, yes, it is true that, and there's like probably history that I'm not as familiar to why that it is. What's the case? Of why does the rail and general transit network in Connecticut is not as impacted by high flood risk? That's like maybe the results of good planning, maybe. But the other thing that I will connect with the previous comment is, flood areas are usually a good indication where you have wetlands and water sensitive locations, like or in terms of water quality concerns. And so that's also good news because if you're concerned about wetland preservation and preserving the quality of those water resources, the fact that most of the transit zone is not within those flood areas is also a good indication that, not just from a resiliency perspective or climate adaptation, but from a water quality perspective, maintaining those locations, it's good news to hear. I'll need to get back to you into the specific percentages and numbers. I'll point to I could just post this in the chat. We did this analysis recently in New Jersey that looked at similar variables. It's not exactly apples to apples because in that case we did a time series analysis or looking trends over time. So I need to like do some homework to like really make the conversion
Yeah.
from one thing to the other. But I'll pull that report in the chat for those that are curious about that comparison.
Yeah, appreciate that, Marcel. And I'll jump to a couple of questions in the chat that got flagged for me. First question is there a best practices benchmark to aim for in terms of the percent of households located within the Connecticut transit zone?
That's a good question. Um, I don't know. I mean, the benchmarks that we use are the ones that have been thoroughly documented and which establish the minimum required densities to support transit service. Like I mentioned in the presentation, the typical range for needed to support regular bus service is considered to be between 6 and 8 units per acre, and in the order of 15 units per acre for express bus service. That numbers goes much higher if you're thinking in terms of downtown areas with jobs. But so that's like the real benchmark that we use in terms of the percentage of the housing stock in the transit zone versus if you look at New Jersey. New Jersey has a higher percentage, slightly higher percentage of its housing stock within what you could consider there the transit zone. Not by much. I'm forgetting but it's like closer to a third compared to. Uh, I'm getting that wrong. It is. I need to review like my New Jersey numbers, but that's a good question. That's a good question of like how much it would require like more like of other states. Like, but the first one that we have documented more thoroughly is New Jersey. We're just doing New York, but yeah, I guess the short answer is like I don't know top hand of a specific benchmark for that percentage. The benchmark that I'm very confident and that we document thoroughly is the one related to density, and that is consistent across other regions. Not just in Connecticut, but we do cite a specific TOD guiding document from the capital region that also uses that benchmark. They also established the 6 to 8 units. So there is documentation supporting that those density benchmarks in the context of Connecticut are the ones that we should be using for guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Marcel, it would be safe to say though, maybe not compared to New Jersey or lower New York, but Connecticut probably has a higher percentage of households near transit than most states, just in general, right? Like that's probably a safe, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, like coastal states, maybe you narrow it down more like to coastal states, like that is like an interesting type of comparison to make that I think we should put on our tasks to. I'm definitely interested in like doing those kinds of comparisons.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because I think sometimes the perception in Connecticut is there's not a lot of public transportation, and what I think this report shows is there's actually a lot. There's not the density we would like to see to support it, but there's a lot more to work with that is really encouraging if you're bullish on Connecticut. Um, okay, another question. What information in our data is Governor Lamont and the Connecticut Chamber, CT Chamber, needing to change his perspective in championing TOD and spur development? Um, so yeah, what information or data does Governor Lamont, general business community in Connecticut need to change his perspective in championing TOD?
Hopefully, some of the stuff that we presented. Um, I mean, I think the general, like the sewer information, flooding information, all point, and the concentration, the disproportionate concentration that this zone has in terms of jobs and the housing and households, like makes a strong case for greater involvement and support coming from the state overall. They need to support financing, funding, but also coordinating, establishing general guidelines and what is the criteria to do to better create that alignment between land use and transit. I think that's what other states are clearly realizing and understanding that they must play a role to facilitate that coordination because it just doesn't happen in a natural organic way. As I mentioned, it makes a lot of sense to pursue this, but it involves sometimes competing goals from stakeholders. Like it's interdisciplinary by nature, and so that creates some complexity and like added resources that the states are best equipped to provide. Uh, so that I feel in general that's the general information, but also what's a little bit puzzling is that in spite of that concentration of jobs and population, when you look at the specific densities and the benchmarks that are used to consider is this sufficient in density to support the transit, the clear answer is no. No. Like the density in a lot of the places across the transit zone should be higher. Otherwise, what you have is either implications on the quality of the service, that the service becomes less reliable, less frequent, or it becomes more heavily subsidized by the state just to maintain that. And so those are kind of the implications of not having that ridership that is associated with the density. And so that's the main takeaways, and hopefully that makes sense for why this is pursuing more of these types of initiatives are needed.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that question, even beyond the Lamont administration, it's been a frustrating era for Connecticut because there has actually been pretty considerable resources put into transit. Obviously, a lot in terms of the Hartford line, some of the branch lines, double tracking. Governor Lamont was just in Waterbury yesterday announcing the redevelopment of that train station, which is where we did a walk a couple of years ago. And to his credit again, CMDA has been launched and now staffed with David Corris to work on this, but there hasn't been that state level coordination, combining resources, combining knowledge, getting data together. That's obviously a big thrust of the work of RIDE proposal specifically. that certainly CMDA is going to starting to fill in some of that, but there's generally not been a consistent state level strategy around this 9% of land. And we think that's an immensely missed opportunity. And even as we've had conversations with some of the COGs so far, there is a little bit of that scarcity mindset of, well, if we do funding in the town with the bus station, the train station, we're not going to get the town without it, or it'll go to the cities and not the suburbs, or the cities generally feel like they don't get the resources the suburbs do. So we run into the political problem where there still isn't that all hands on deck approach for this 9% of land, because we certainly believe that if you do a good job of this, get that density level up, you actually get more ROI in the state investment that we've already done. Rising tide lift all boats. So we would like to see that kind of coordination. And I have one sort of related question.
Can I go back? Like I did my homework and checked the previous question on the benchmark of what percentage of the housing stock could be considered like a good benchmark. I mean, I don't have a second, but comparing this to New Jersey, the housing stock about 45% of the stock in New Jersey is within the transit zone, compared to Connecticut's 48%. So they're very close to one another. Like nearly half of the housing stock is within the transit zone. But New Jersey is a little bit more sprawly, if you will. Like it's like not like just by 3% points, not a big difference, but they're comparable in that regard. I will look into New York, not like the entire state, but like kind of the MTA service area, because I'd be curious about that same metric in the context of the Hudson Valley, New York City, and Long Island. But stay tuned.
So we have probably time for one more question, and there was a question just about generally what are our feelings regarding, local control, the unwillingness to make local changes. I'll just address that quickly. We do know there's some towns that don't want this type of density, but our fundamental belief is that actually a lot of towns do. Out of the 111 communities in Connecticut that have some type of transit service, there are about 40 that have some kind of TOD zoning or TOD plan or study. And about 10 of those communities have passed some type of district. A lot of them, they're sitting on the shelves waiting for state funding and resources. So there are definitely towns that will resist this type of work. And there's a different political strategy from that. But at a policy level, we really think there's a lot of interest in communities, local governments, local businesses that understand the value of these transit zones and just need more coordination and state level response. But the last question is, would RPA be able to use this analysis to identify the best opportunities for housing and economic development not within the current station access zones that potentially could be served in the future, either by bus or rail? There's just generally a question of, are we saying that's it for transit that exists currently, or are there places where there might be better or new transit?
That's a great question. I think for the bus network in particular, we will want to explore that option because, as Pete mentioned, and I also alluded in the information from the report, there are locations that are in the Seward service area that have enough density that are above the thresholds of the 8 unit per acre benchmark that we use, that have like enough land use mix. So a lot of the attributes that you would associate with like a more walkable, like multifamily oriented area, but what's missing is the transit. Like so, that's a great opportunity to rethink in some cases the network design. Like, do we need in the schedules? Like, could we reroute things to serve these areas that already have a lot of the attributes? And like that's a lot more feasible when you're thinking and when it comes to the bus network. For rail, that could also be a consideration, but that's like a much longer term thing, right? But definitely something that we'll be considering for the bus part for sure.
Yeah, and I've alluded to this bus campaign. We're really interested in improving existing service, getting headways down, making it intra-city connections a lot better. So there's a lot of work in the existing 9% that we think we can improve pretty considerably. But there definitely are those pockets where maybe even there's transit, technically speaking, and a couple of the cogs have transit districts that have a lot of stations. The service might not be as frequent. So yeah, I don't think, again, we're not building new rail connections. A couple of new stations could be plopped in. Of course, there's conversations and fields underway. West Hartford, North Haven, Groton are station names that come up quite a bit. East Haven, but we don't think we have kicked the tires a little bit on where was there existing rail infrastructure that hasn't been used for commercial or for passenger service, but that doesn't seem realistic. But improving the bus service certainly does. And then there was just a question about, can you restate the stat about municipalities in Connecticut with TOD legislation? Oh yeah, this was analysis we did a couple years ago, Desegregate Connecticut, and 169 municipalities in Connecticut, about 111 of them have some type of bus or rail service. Again, wide variety of frequency. Of those 111, give or take 15 or so, maybe 18 have some kind of TOD district or overlay that's passed, that's been in law, and some developments happening. There are another 20, 25 that have a TOD study or a plan, whether it's a municipal level or a COG level. And those are really some rich opportunities. We've done walks in Ridgefield that's been sitting on a plan. Manchester is one example. So there are places like that with a little bit of push from state resources could actually unlock quite a bit of development. I think that's up on a couple of the resources we've got for Workload Ride, Matt. All right, so it brings us right to 1 o'clock. So with that, I just want to thank everybody. Great turnout, really great conversation. Again, appreciate the conversation, Marcel, and the research you and the team has done. And just hoping folks stay involved, stay on the newsletter, and look forward to a lot of emails, hopefully about a special session coming up in November. But, more further along when we get the next report out, we'd likely do another one of these events. So stay tuned for that. And all the rest of you have a good rest of your week.
Thanks, Pete.